Shut up and sit down.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, and I'm joined today once more by KC. KC, thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
So we had a pretty good conversation last time that went for about an hour and a half, one of the longest podcasts I've done, which we just talked about woke ideology, and we talked about the epistemology that accompanies it and why it is so nefarious, why it seems to have pestilentially spread into the public consciousness. And so today we're going to see if we can focus more on the history behind the academic implementation of woke ideology, how it infested the institutions, and whether or not we should be concerned about it becoming more and more popular into the STEM fields, because I don't know if we mentioned this before last time, but now it's starting to become pretty popular in the hard sciences. And I think there was recently a whole hoopla about whether or not 2 + 2 can equal 5, and they said well, if you do it in base 10, whatever. But
even then it doesn't work.
Yeah, even if you go
there's no basis you can select that it's going to make 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah, it's weird times, and it really is concerning, because I think one of the things that we have to agree on as a society is a foundational bedrock of axioms. I recognize the claim that, hey, maybe there are some different perspectives there that we need to take into consideration. That's perfectly fine. But now when you're changing the game from different perspectives to different epistemologies, to different ways of thinking, I don't think our civilization can survive that way. We need to agree on some set of axioms to propel society into the future. That's how you have technological advancement, scientific advancements, and moral advancement. I'd even go so far as to say, do you think that there's some room for, well, sure, maybe this person who grew up indigenous, they have different ways of knowing, different understandings of mathematics, let's say. Do you think there's room for that? And what are the limits of that, if that makes any sense?
Well, my political ideology is basically liberalism. And liberalism, as you maybe know, is rooted in methodological individualism. It's the idea that fundamentally it's the individual that matters in a society. Mm-hmm. And to that end, I think that everybody should be free to, pursue their own conception of the good within reason. And within reason, this clause, this kind of sets up the parameters of civil society. But without going into too much detail, everybody should be open to express and pursue their own values. I mean, you have, as I believe, you have only one life, and I think it's a waste of life if you live it on purely other people's terms. I wouldn't want to impose that on anyone. Mm-hmm. That being said, as part of this within reason clause, this parameter of civil society, there have to be certain boundaries as to how far particular worldviews get expressed, especially with institutional mechanisms like those that are involved in the propagation of scientific education. So if you want to believe that the universe is 6,000 years old, or that evolution is a lie, or that, I don't know, whatever it is you believe, you're free to do that. But imposing it on our institutions, or imposing other ideologies onto our institutions that are similarly rooted in untruths, you have to draw the line, especially when it comes to something like education.
Yeah, this is why it's for that reason why I'm very concerned when you have someone like Trump trying to withdraw federal funding from universities that implement CRT, or from public high schools that do it. That really concerns me, because I think I get it. I am also critical race theory. I think it's nefarious. I think it's dangerous. But the big problem with that is that we need to agree that CRT is a bad thing from a cultural standpoint. We need to all collectively agree that critical race theory is a bad thing based on our own personal values. Otherwise, if you have a government and someone as polarizing as Donald Trump, if you have him saying that CRT is a bad thing, that the new way of anti-racist thought is a bad thing, you're just going to politicize it, because there's people out there, and I think this is the vast majority of people. We touched on this last time, where most people don't really think too deeply about what exactly is going on, where does this woke stuff come from. As far as they're concerned, they'll just look at something like anti-racism, and they'll look at something like critical race theory, and they go, oh, what is it? Okay, it's against racism. That's good. Who doesn't like this? Donald Trump doesn't like it. Oh, of course he doesn't. And so now it's just like a political game. So we need to agree culturally first that this thing is bad, and then maybe if we do something, governmental about it, then sure.
Yeah, it's important to have that discussion. It's important to get people on board and understand what exactly something like critical race theory is proposing before you actually take this kind of action. I mean, I can see there's a strategic argument to be made, and there's also a moral argument to be made. But as for where this stuff comes from, that is in and of itself a very interesting story, and it's one that's actually much older than most people realize. We can talk about how the academy came into the current state it is because of certain ideas that found timely political application in the 60s and 70s, but it's much older than that. People will say, okay, maybe it began with the Frankfurt School, with the introduction of critical theory, or at least their version of critical theory, since critical theory actually preceded them. But that's not necessarily true either. They were important to the story, but it begins even before then. Well, okay, they'll say maybe it begins with Marx and Engels. And again, they're important to the story as well, but they're not the start of it. The story actually begins all the way in the 18th century with the debate between empiricists and rationalists. And in fact, you might even argue that it goes all the way back to ancient Greece, to Aristotelian versus Platonic thought, but we need not go that far. I think the debate between the empiricists and the rationalists, and how Kant ended up resolving it, and the ambiguities in how he resolved it, fundamentally is the starting point for how these ideas developed over time, and how kind of the methodological and epistemological errors first started coming into the fore.
Huh. It's interesting that you bring it back then to the empiricists versus the rationalists, whether or not everything could be derived from sense experience, or whether or not you can shut yourself off from all senses and still come to some level of knowledge. And I think, this is my knee-jerk reaction, because it's the first time I've heard of critical theory be linked back to this school of philosophical thought. I think you're onto something, because we're still talking about the acquisition of knowledge and whether or not there's any objectivity to that knowledge. And then you also mentioned Kant. I'm assuming you're talking about like the synthetic and analytic distinction a priori.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think you're actually, I think you might be onto something there. So then the question then becomes, were the people who taught like at the Frankfurt School in the 60s, where critical theory first came to fruition, what was the philosophical thought that they adopted? My assumption would be that it's definitely not the empiricist one. So
right.
Yeah.
They
by the
were.
way, we should probably sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Most people listening to this, not at the fault of their own, probably don't really know too much about what it is we're talking about when we talk about Kant or the empiricist versus the rationalist. So just would you mind giving a quick rundown?
Yeah, sure. So the empiricists, as you indicated, thought that all knowledge fundamentally derives from sense experience, and the big key figures in this that are typically cited are people like John Locke and George Berkeley, and especially, most importantly, David Hume, who's in my considered opinion one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. And then you had the rationalists, who thought that all knowledge can fundamentally be derived from reason, from the application of pure logic. And these will be people like René Descartes and Leibniz. And oftentimes, classically, Spinoza has also been included in this group, but I have my reasons for actually thinking there's a reading of him that's radically and intriguingly empiricist. But putting that off to the side, this is generally how they're categorized. Generally, you have people like Spinoza categorized as rationalists, people who think that all knowledge can be derived from reason, and then you have empiricists, people who think that you can derive all knowledge from your interaction with the world through your five senses.
Okay.
And there were, this was the big set of debates in the 17th and 18th centuries. Fundamentally, how does knowledge come to be? And you can study the arguments that were interesting, and they advanced, they advanced epistemology quite a bit during that time. And Hume finally came along and started issuing some major challenges to rationalists that they had a very hard time dealing with. The force of his arguments were really quite something. Yeah, but basically you have this conflict taking place between the empiricists and the rationalists. And ultimately, Immanuel Kant comes along, and he manages to synthesize the two to some degree. He leaned more rationalist than empiricist, but his transcendental idealism fundamentally was an effort at reconciling the differences between these two camps. He was a very rare figure in this regard, because you can think of the empiricists as sort of issuing from the Aristotelian tradition, and rationalists as issuing from the Platonic tradition. And every so often, once every few generations, a philosopher comes along who manages to synthesize these two schools of thought. In the medieval times, it was Thomas Aquinas. At the end of the Enlightenment, at the beginning of modernity, it was Immanuel Kant. This is one of the reasons why he's widely regarded as one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. Basically, I don't want to get too deep into Kant's thought, into how he derived his entire program. But basically, you can create two sets of distinctions. You can create a distinction between analytic propositions and synthetic propositions, and you can create a distinction between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. And so analytic versus synthetic, what's this all about? Well, analytic basically pertains to propositions that contain knowledge as a fundamental property of the language being used. So you have a proposition with a subject and a predicate, and you have a set of propositions that derive some kind of conclusion. And if the conclusion can be derived expressly from some set of propositions without any reference necessarily to the external world, that's an analytic proposition. So examples of this would be something like 7 + 5 = 12. Someone like Kant might have argued that the concept of 12 contains the concepts of 7 and 5. This is how you can kind of derive the conclusion. And you can have, definitional stuff works like this. What's a bachelor? A bachelor is an unmarried man. So if you have an argument, you set up some premises that include, the proposition X is a bachelor, and then it concludes with X is an unmarried man. That's a synthetic analytic proposition, regardless of whether X is a real person or not. The concept is self-contained. And then you have the synthetic type of proposition, which makes some kind of reference to the external world. This is the kind of proposition that empiricists held to be fundamentally the source of knowledge. And then you have this other distinction, a priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. So a priori knowledge that you have, is basically a condition for being a thinking being. So René Descartes did say, "I think, therefore I am." So that would be his idea of an a priori proposition. And then a posteriori, this is John Locke's idea that there's nothing in the mind that did not first originate in the senses. So nothing that comes into your mind gets there without first having issued from the external world, or whether or not there's an external world, from sense data that you proceed to process. And Kant ended up reconciling all of this by combining analytics, synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, and then drawing from one particular combination of these, synthetic a priori. So these are propositions about the world, but they're propositions about the world that are intuitive to us, propositions that we're kind of born with as a condition for being a thinking being. You kind of have to have synthetic a priori knowledge. And these will be things like space and time, for example. These are properties intrinsic to the universe, but in order to be able to even think about anything, you have to have first these concepts in your mind. And from there, he kind of derived his entire epistemological program, as expressed in his critique of pure reason. Okay, so why is Kant important? Well, when he ended up deriving his epistemic program, it's possible to engage in different types of readings of this work. And one particular reading that ultimately ended up over many generations and many, additions and revisions and blah, 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 what do you expect to happen to an idea over time? After all this time passes, you end up with what we have today as woke ideology. I'm not saying that Kant himself was woke, or that wokeness is a necessary antecedent to Kant's ideology, or to Kant's transcendental idealism, but that this was the starting point. This was kind of the first step, the first major step one takes in order to move into woke ideology. And it's a particular interpretation of Kant that enables this, a kind of one that emphasizes the primacy of your experience of the world, and the role that your mind plays in constructing the world. And as you continue through the decades of the 19th century, this gets, there are amendments which are added to this idea and revisions. So you have your Hegelians. Hegel was an important character in this story because he was fundamentally what influenced Marx's idea. Marx took Hegel's ideas and materialized them. And of course, he's an important story, or an important figure in the history of critical theory. I mean, you could make the argument that critical theory began with Marx and Engels. So these ideas gain traction over time. They get revised. You have the introduction of existentialism as a kind of reaction to some of these ideas. You have Hegelianism, and you have eventually the development of things like phenomenology as well, with Edmund Husserl and Perle-Montet and all these other characters, and all of these different lines of thought, the critical theory, the phenomenology, the existentialism, they all come together. Well, I should say I added critical theory in that category. Really, critical theory is in many ways a conjunction of many of these strands of thought. It's itself a conjunction of existential and phenomenological, and of course Marxist doctrines about the world. And certain interpretation. We often speak of critical theory as though it's this one big monolith, and that's kind of stayed constant over time. In reality, there are many critical theories, and there are many generations of critical theory that differ importantly from one another. But we often focus on the Frankfurt School because this was the critical one. Well, no pun intended. This was the one that's really important to the development of what we now recognize as woke ideology. This was the generation that ended up leaving Germany and coming to America and exporting the ideas into the Anglosphere, in the Anglospheric Academy. In a very different socio-political context than what was going on with Europe. These different socio-political, the socio-political context unique to America with its own unique racial issues, and its own particular conception of gender started mixing with critical theory and produced this very different approach to the liberal democratic approach that you and I might endorse. And fundamentally, this is where things like critical race theory issue from. Critical race theory is itself started out as a legal theory, a kind of reaction to another legal school of thought called legal pragmatism. Without going too deeply into it, critical race theory basically is the legal application of critical theory, specifically as it relates to race. And of course, intersectionality derives largely from critical race theory, as well as Black feminism. These are also touched by critical theory. We could talk for hours and hours about each individual school of thought, and you could go generation to generation, look at all the ideas, and you can kind of see how they come together to form what we now recognize as critical theory in all its methodological and epistemic, quote unquote, glory.
Mm-hmm. And how do these things manage to attach themselves to popular academic thought? Because sure, it's always been in there, and maybe it to some extent it was just very esoteric, just a few people dabbling in it. But now it's at a point where it's pretty popular among the humanities. We're not talking about a few people believing that power dynamics is the central thing that we need to focus on when analyzing sociological structures. Now it is the thing that we focus on. So what because from what I read, and I could be wrong, it seemed like sure it existed in the 60s and the 70s. No one really paid that much attention to it. It wasn't until the 90s where you had applied postmodernism that it really took these fields by storm. And now, ever since like 2015, now it's even seeping into the public consciousness. So what is your take on like how it managed to attach itself and become popular?
There's no one explanation for this, or indeed any complex phenomenon. It was the conjunction of many different circumstances that allowed woke ideology to gain the foothold of power that it has. So the applied postmodernism you're alluding to, the development of intersectionality, right? That was a key step in taking various contradictory lines of radical thought and sort of unifying them. Synthesizing them within a grand unified theory of oppression, and one with a lot of politically actionable potential, even though theoretically there's a very little there. That's we could get into that. Mm-hmm. So the development of intersectionality was an important step. The corporatization of the academy. Administratively created the mechanism by which intersectionality could eventually take over the academy. This was not done on purpose. Corporate interests did not come together with the express purpose of making intersectionality popular. It just provided the institutional mechanisms through which intersectionality could go from being in critical race theory could go from being these little insulated esoteric bubbles in the academy and to this monolith to this very repressive powerful system that it is today.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Oh, you first.
I was just going to say, do you think there's any merit in the concept of intersectionality? Because it seems like our intuitions would say that, yeah, what intersectionality is saying is probably pretty true.
So intersectionality, there are multiple levels at which you can understand it. And the basic level, the PR phase of intersectionality tells a story of how there used to be this struggle for oppression that was done basically along different lines. So there was feminism, which was interested in the liberation of women. There was racial issues, which were interested in there were racial liberation movements interested in race issues, LGBT, blah, 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 blah. Every demographic has its own liberation movement. And the story goes that they were kind of, they were distinct from one another, and there was something missing from their activism and from their analytic frameworks. So the example that Kimberly Crenshaw gave when she introduced the term intersectionality in 1989 was of a Black woman who wants to sue her employer for discrimination against Black women. And she has a difficulty in this case because the employer can say, hey, look, I've hired Black people, but all the Black people are men. And I've hired women, but all the women are white. She's the only Black woman in the company. And under the discrimination laws that didn't take intersectionality into account, it was difficult for her to argue her own case. I don't know what the outcome of that case was, or if it was a real case, or I don't remember the specifics of the paper. But her point was that it was necessary to combine these various demographic struggles into one comprehensive, unified framework that's going to apply critical theory in service of changing society. And all of the demographics and all combinations of demographics have to be taken into account. And the story goes something like white feminists ignored the struggle of Black women, and racial activism ignored the struggle of women, and on and on and on. If it's not intersectional, it's bullshit. And the story is just that. It's a story. It's Whig history. It's the story told by the triumphant victor of a struggle with its competing ideologies in order to legitimize itself. It's not actually true that, for example, white feminists, quote unquote white feminism, ignored the issues of race. It's not true that this was not taken into account, before the development of intersectionality. I can point to papers, famous papers by people like Donna Haraway, who's a white feminist. I mean, she's white, and she is a feminist. I don't mean she subscribes to quote unquote white feminism. Mm-hmm. And in her 1984 paper, the cyborg, or what was it? The Cyborg Manifesto. Something like that. I think it's the Cyborg Manifesto. She's touching upon intersectional themes, a full half decade before Kimberly Crenshaw comes onto the scene with intersectionality. These topics were not being ignored. They were being actively discussed before intersectionality came along. But after intersectionality, sort of absorbed all of these various strands of emancipatory and radical activism and scholarship into its own umbrella, into its own coalition, it then told this story about how all of them on their own were insufficient, and only together, under the rubric of intersectionality, can they be complete. And this is how it sort of historically legitimates itself. Mm-hmm. As far as the actual propositions of intersectionality, on the surface, they seem trivial. If we say that women are going to have a harder time of it than men, and Black people are going to have a harder time of it than white people, then Black women are going to have a harder time of it than either Black men or white women. Right? That seems trivial. That doesn't seem like the sort of thing that is going to excite people the way intersectionality actually does. And the reason for that is because there's much more to intersectionality than just this very simple milquetoast proposition. This is the public PR phase, as I said. This is the face of the Whig historian who tells the story of their ideology, of their movement, in a manner that's flattering and not necessarily true. It exists to consolidate its own power, and which presents to the general public this public relations face where it's just about taking different types of oppression into account and listening to people's lived experience and taking that seriously. But there's more to it than that. And the reason there's more to it than that is because of these lines of thought that influence it. The phenomenological lines of thought, the emancipatory existentialist lines of thought. There are certain presuppositions associated with these that once you get into them, if you take, for example, a scientific outlook, a naturalistic scientific outlook, these propositions are much more contentious. But because they're wrapped up in contemporary political, racial, and gender and sexual orientation issues, it's very difficult to contradict them without people suspecting you of having some sort of, I don't know, prejudicial attitude toward these groups. So this is one of the ways intersectionality has been able to protect itself from proper sustained criticism. As most of us know, any critique of these ideas is going to get you labeled a racist or a sexist, a homophobe, a transphobe, istophobe, and that's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario, or depending on your attitude, maybe best case scenario, they just say you're stupid, you're uneducated, you need to read more on intersectionality. You have to engage with it until you understand it, aka you have to keep reading until you believe it and accept intersectionality into your heart. There's more to intersectionality than what I've just laid out here.
Yeah, it's really interesting to the PR problem that these people seem. Well, it's not a problem because it's working, but it's a problem that we have in which you can have something labeled as anti-racist, and the assumption would be that it is nothing more than wanting equity and being against racism and making sure that everybody is on a level playing field. And so people adopt these monikers, not knowing that they're also buying into a million other things that is associated with that ideology. It's a huge PR problem, especially when what they do with the opposition is that they label you, as you said, either a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe. And so this creates this meta-narrative in which people who are anti-racist or who are just looking into what anti-racism is, they'll see that moniker, they'll adopt it, and then they'll look at everybody else as, oh, these people must be racists and bigots. And the problem is that people like you and I don't have this narrative that we can attach ourselves to. I think Coleman Hughes was talking about this in this podcast with John McWhorter, in which it's very easy for them to basically tell the story. The anti-racists or the wokesters, it's very easy for them to tell the story of the oppressor versus the oppressed, or the good guys versus the bad guys, anti-racist versus the racist. This is a story that they can sell to the public that is attractive, and because it is so attractive, then people will be able to join it. But what exactly is our story? From their perspective, all they see is people like us arguing against the anti-racists, arguing against the feminists of today, and it makes us look really bad. So is there a story that we could tell on our own? Like, is it just...
Well, that's what I mentioned last time we talked. You do need a story, and you do need bumper stickers to issue from that story for the general population to be able to attach themselves to. If you want to be a politically relevant movement, if you want your ideas to have kind of widespread appeal, you need a delivery system for the general population. You can't expect everyone to pore over the history of philosophy and social thought for the past 200 years. You can't expect them to look at these debates between the empiricists and the rationalists and build from there and say, oh, okay, I see what additional ideas are attached to intersectionality that could make it, there has to be a narrative that's delivered to the general population in the same way that they do. Their story that they tell, they don't attach all of the hidden premises. It's a very easy to tell, very simple, very condensed story that will fit on an Instagram story or inside of a tweet. And that's by design. Political dissidents need to develop something like that on their own. That's fundamentally a strategic question. My primary interest is in looking at the actual philosophical contents of these ideas. You know, I'll leave the strategic aspects to you know, to propagandists and to political actors. But for my own part, I'm going to just look at the ideas and try to unpack the Trojan horse, see what intersectionality is sneaking into the conversation that it doesn't make clear from the outset.
Yeah, and so the entire enterprise of science, or the scientific institution, is very much in line with empiricist line of thinking, right? So like empiricists revered, they love fields like physics and the hard sciences. And so, you know, the TLDR of science is like, you have a hypothesis, you test it, whatever. But now it seems like, well, things are changing. And so what are sort of these like critical ideas, or the sort of like absence of senses that we're now witnessing in science? Like, you know, we sort of alluded to one of them, the whole 2 + 2 = 5 arguments. But like, what is it that we're now noticing in the hard sciences that makes us think the methodology that we implemented into science in the first place to make sure that it is true, that it is scientific, is now sort of eroding?
Well, at the present, intersectional ideology is restricting itself mostly to the administrative aspects of science. So, to kind of these peripheral bureaucratic structures that are associated with what, for lack of a better term, we might call scientific authority. It's the way you can get public health officials to say that racism is a public health issue. Of course, it's not. This is not what public health actually is. But you know, if you can get these administrative structures in place, then you can start turning science as a member, or so I should say, scientific institutions as a member of the intersectional coalition. So science is no longer done for the purpose of advancing our knowledge. It's also done in service of advancing a particular political ideology. And when these two things come into conflict, when the knowledge that is produced is in conflict with the normative values of that ideology, then the science is wrong and the ideology is correct. And this is the biggest danger that I see coming from this. So if you do research into sex differences, or God help you, race differences, it doesn't really matter how good the methodology is. The fact that you're even looking at these things is immediately suspect, which is bizarre to me, because you know I've seen similar attitudes from religious fundamentalist people in my family. You know, I brought a friend over once who she studied the sexual habits of slugs, and you know, this is, as a scientist, she's reading papers and doing observational studies on slugs and their sexual habits. And these fundamentalist family members think she's some kind of pervert. Why is she engaged in this bestiality of slug sex? You know, they don't understand. It's the same kind of normative judgmentalness that you see from intersectional critics of this kind of research. People like Dagna Joel. She did sex research in I think in Israel, and you know, she went on television and said the fact that that people are even looking into this, you know, the question of sex differences is not even a legitimate question to be asked. So that's the danger. It constrains the type of knowledge that's allowed to be true.
Yeah, I remember what I was thinking is that, well, usually these two things are compartmentalized, right? You have your ideology on the one hand, and then you have your thirst for scientific knowledge on the other. I forget who it was. It might have been who was it? I forget who it was. But basically, he's a scientist who says he's a Christian in his private time, but as soon as he enters the lab, he acts as if he's an atheist. Usually,
That
there's
sounds
always,
like Francis Collins.
I think you're correct. Yeah, I think that's who it was. And so there's always been, as far as I could tell, there's always been the separation between ideology and work. But now, when your ideology explicitly takes a political form and it tells you it's not enough for you to believe these things, you have to actively act against these sort of bad ideas that are out there in the world. You have to be political about it. Now, by definition, it has to infect your own personal work. It has to infect science.
Right.
That you do your research because you're told to do so.
Yeah. And
sorry, I thought you were going to say something.
This is going to end up ceding ground as far as knowledge production is concerned to nations, to countries that don't care about this crap. Nations that say the science is whatever the science is, and we're going to move forward with it regardless of whether or not the political ideology says it's haram. The United States, this is the trajectory for how a nation falls behind in scientific and technological advancement, and ends up costing everyone for it.
Yeah, and it's like it really is a shame because the United States, for all our faults, we don't score very well compared to other first world nations, but because the best academic institutions, the best research institutions are in the United States, we tend to rank one on science and technology. Now, that's not because obviously these research universities have foreign people, so that's an obvious case, but these institutions are in the United States. But if this is the type of research that are being conducted, there's no way we're going to maintain that number one spot unless we change the rules of the game, which is what I'm concerned about doing so. I don't know if this will happen because a lot of people like to say that it's that this is mainly an American phenomenon. If you go to other first world countries, with the few exceptions, like the UK is pretty wokey, Canada is also pretty wokey, but generally speaking, if you go to Belgium, Denmark, Germany, these ideas they're there, but they're nowhere near as strong as they are in the United States. The United States is the bastion for this type of mentality. And you could point towards many sociological reasonings behind why that's the case, but generally speaking, that's what it is. But I'm not convinced that is going to remain that way. When I look at people, when I look at the percentage of people, the rate at which people are leaving woke ideology or turning their back against it or finding out what it is and disagreeing with it, I don't think that rate is higher. I think that rate is lower than the rate at which people are either indoctrinated into the woke ideology or they subscribe to it, or they see it and they don't really care about it. And by not caring about it, this is going to be a woke sentence that I say, by not caring about it, they are complicit in it actually becoming more and more popular. So I don't know for a fact that the claim that this is mainly an American phenomenon and in other countries it's not that bad. I don't know if that's true because when I see what's going on in the BBC or what's going on in European countries, it still seems to be like a pretty big deal. But even if it were the case that it's not anywhere near as huge as it is in the United States, I'm not convinced that it's not going to get any better in those countries.
Yeah. When I'm thinking specifically about America's competitors, I'm thinking about Russia. Russian institutions are not afflicted by this. It's afflicted by a whole bunch of other crap. I'm not saying that I would rather live in Russia or that I think Russia's politics are superior. In many ways, Russia's politics are absolute shit. But they're shit in a different way. When it comes to the actual production of scientific knowledge, this woke ideology is not going to constrain their capacity to improve their science and technology and gain a competitive edge over us.
Okay, yeah, gotcha. Yeah, that's definitely true. But what are your thoughts on the other? I don't know if you research into this, but the other claim that, well, first world countries that are still for the most part liberal democracies, they're still going to actually they don't really care about this woke stuff, but by not caring about it, it's going to get bigger, or even then they're becoming more convinced to abide by it.
Well, it's certainly much more prominent in the Anglosphere, and I agree that there are sociological reasons for this. The corporatization of the academy is particularly strong in Anglospheric nations. But we should probably talk about that and the role that plays in facilitating this kind of ideological takeover.
Okay.
At the end of the day, I think that we shouldn't look to external sources of help. I don't think we should wait for the country that balances liberal democracy and its value for science to come and save us. I think we have to do that on our own. I think we have to be the ones to change our own culture. And that will begin by combating woke ideology in the arena of propaganda, which currently they have a corner in that market.
Yeah. Do you think one of the ways that we start by doing that is making sure that people aren't scared to talk about it? Because like time after time, you'll get not a whistleblower, but you'll get someone basically saying that, yeah, they want to talk about this stuff, they want to argue against their colleagues, but they're concerned about it. And then you have the usual argument against this, like cancel culture is not real. It's just, someone like Steven Pinker's never going to get fired. He's way too big. Yeah, sure. But the very fact, even if that were the case, right? Ignoring people like Colin Wright, who basically couldn't get a job anymore, ignoring those people and saying, generally speaking, cancel culture is not a real thing. The very fact that it feels like it's real, the very fact that people are worried about even talking about it, is evidence of a problem, of a genuine problem. So do we first start when we're trying to change the academic institutions back to the way they were? Do we first start by making sure that people aren't scared to even talk about this in the first place? Because for all we know, most people in the academy actually are against this woke thing, but we don't know because no one wants to talk about it.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I do think fundamentally you have to start out by looking at the source of the threat that's keeping everybody quiet. And that, of course, is the administrative and bureaucratic mechanisms that are basically putting a gun to people's head and asking, do you agree with this ideology? Well, I say metaphorical puts a gun to their head, but we've seen in other times and places this kind of thing, when it gets out of control, is not so metaphorical. But as it currently stands, yeah, you do stand to lose your job. The James Damore business was a very clear illustration of what happens when you go against the intersectional grain, against this. Well, we won't even get that deeply into that, but we know what happens to people, and the people responsible for having this threat, the people who engage in this kind of power over potential dissidents and keeping them quiet, they are the managerial, administrative, and bureaucratic elements in these various institutions. And fundamentally, I would suspect that a good, effective propaganda campaign to counteract woke propaganda would be one that specifically targets these bureaucratic mechanisms. And one way to do that, perhaps, is to create our own language, our own set of interrelated terms. A very subversive idea, I think, to basically do something like what James Lindsay is doing with the creation of the woke dictionary, but integrate that into our language so that anytime woke folk make use of our language, and anytime they make contact with the words that we've created, they are, whether they realize it or not, accepting premises. We sneak our own Trojan horses into their language, into their use of language, and they accept certain premises, whether they realize it or not, when they start using our language. And so we can use their own strategy against them. We can apply their own postmodernist strategy against them and start deconstructing terms that they hold dear, terms like what constitutes a social, what is a society, what's a social activity, or more fundamentally, what's a lived experience, right? You deconstruct. They love to deconstruct things like gender and race and sex and all these other things. But if you start applying those very same tools of deconstruction to lived experience, oh boy, you're in trouble. They get very mad very quickly because that's one of the sacred cows. But you apply these same corrosive tools to their own sacred cows, and you create your own language loaded with its own set of presuppositions and force them to use that language. And before long, I think you can have an effective counter-propaganda campaign against woke propaganda, and start to perhaps develop these bumper stickers that people can start applying. I've even toyed around with some of the possible terms that can be used, but this is something that a dedicated group of propagandists is going to have to work on if they want to see effective political application of political dissidents against woke folk.
Yeah, I think one of the most effective things that we could probably do within the academy is attack the academic disciplines that peddle this sort of stuff. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so it's not enough for someone to say, yeah, this woke ideology is bad, this epistemology is bad. Well, maybe just a good way to torpedo this sort of stuff is to be, instead of saying this ideology is bad or this woke stuff is bad, what's being taught in gender studies is terrible. What's being taught in post-colonial studies, in fat studies, in Chicano studies is just nonsense. And there should be some academic expectations that every academic discipline should strive for. And the fact that these departments are acting in the way that they are, acquiring knowledge in the way that they are, is an institutional embarrassment. It is an embarrassment to the university system. This is not what the university system was put in place to do. So the only problem is that would probably cause a civil war on every university campus if we actually do that.
Bring it
So
on. Let's install organs of quality control. I played around with this idea of what I call the duodenum. The duodenum is sort of the start of the large intestine, which filters out the nutrients from the crap. And that's basically what the duodenum on a university campus would do. It would filter out the nutrients from the crap. It would basically engage in quality control audits of different departments, and ultimately, based on common standards, it would be able. I think it would deal a very serious blow to the credibility of departments like the gender studies and ethnic studies and all this other studies disciplines, the grievance studies disciplines. I think that could be a very effective tool if such organs were to be implemented. So yeah, you have to attack the hubs in which these ideas are being generated and promulgated, and you also have to attack the bureaucratic vectors that are transmitting it to other parts of society.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that one of the biggest, this is something that I've been thinking about recently just because I'm seeing it become more and more popular, and I often wonder if people know what doing this entails, is like this whole fiasco of putting your pronouns in your bio, where the original claim, or the sort of the knee-jerk reaction to this would be that the reasoning behind why they're doing this is because they're in solidarity with either the trans community or the non-binary community, whatever it may be. But every time I see that, because you can tend to, in the same way that someone tells you that they don't believe in climate change, you can probably predict every single one of their other positions. When you see someone with pronouns in their bio, you can pretty consistently predict their predictions.
It's a
predict
shibboleth.
Yeah.
It's a way of signaling your allegiance. It's the Rolex watch that the rich person wears to signal their superiority to the hoi polloi. It's the coat of arms that the noble puts on their wall to signify their superiority to the peasantry, right? It's just a shibboleth. That's all it ever was. That's all it will ever be. It has nothing to do with solidarity.
Yeah, and it makes it, what makes it abundantly obvious that at least some people are playing that game is that when I'm in class and people type in, their names into Zoom, and they have a list of all the students in that Zoom meeting, no one is seeing your face. No one is interacting with you. In fact, in many of these classes, you're not allowed to unmute yourself and talk over the teacher. You're not allowed to do that. You have to type it up. And people are putting their pronouns right next to their name for literally no reason. You are not going to be interacted with. It is so obvious why you are putting that in, especially it's 70 students in this class and just one or two people with pronouns in their names. You're not hiding it very well.
Right. It's just a shibboleth. I've had students who do that. And if they want to do that, they're free to. I'm not going to stop them. But, I know the game that's being played. And, I wasn't born yesterday. I know what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the strangest ones, though, Peter Boghossian tweeted out something, and he got ratioed for this because it was interesting. The first part of his tweet I agreed with, that like it's more of a virtue signaling mechanism to signal to people where you stand on particular social and political issues. Yeah, I get that. The one part that he went a bit deeper, and I think this is probably the main reason why he got ratioed, was that he didn't stop there. He went so far as he went really deep to say it also matters where you put it in your bio, whether or not you put it at the beginning, whether or not you put it at the end. I think that's what concerns me about this. And I don't really like use I don't really use the argument against pronouns in this way, because one of the things that I argue against when it comes to critical theories is that you kind of have to read people's minds in order to make the claims that you're making. So when you're saying that the reason why white people are so reluctant to talk about race, or why if you mention their white privilege they get very defensive, that is because of their white fragility, and they're scared that they're going to lose their power as at the top of the hierarchy. One of the many problems that I have with this thinking is that, well, you're technically reading people's minds. But when we also do the same thing with criticizing people for putting pronouns in their bio, and it matters where they put it at the beginning or at the end, aren't we also kind of doing the same thing? We're kind of reading their people's minds. What is the difference between us and the white fragility thinking?
Yeah, so you can examine people's behaviors, and you can look at pattern in people's behaviors, and you can kind of draw inferences using your folk psychology as to what's actually going on. Whereas something like critical race theory, the modus operandi is very simple. It's much simpler than most people realize. Step one is to identify something, anything, some institution, some idea, some person, some behavior, whatever it is. Work of art. Just identify it. Step two, interpret the behavior or the contents of the book or whatever as uncharitably as humanly possible. This is racist. This is promulgating white supremacy, and you twist yourself into a pretzel logic, interpreting with the tools of critical theory. And step three is to pretend to have learned something. And this over flexibility of interpretation, of the ability to look at anything and interpret it in the manner that's concordant with your ideology, and then reify that, and pretend that what you've interpreted is what's actually there, and not just a product of your own bias. This is really central to the problems of critical theory generally, and phenomenology, the phenomenological aspect of it specifically. We're often appealed to, quote unquote, listen to the lived experiences of the marginalized. But when you deconstruct the meaning of this, when you look at what lived experience actually entails, and what the associated phenomenological philosophy contains, what you're really being asked to do is to treat some subset of some groups, so namely the subset that is politically engaged with intersectionality in a manner that's flattering to it. So they agree with intersectionality. You look specifically at that subset of whatever demographic whose lived experiences you're supposedly listening to. Ignore the rest. The rest are grifters, they're Uncle Toms, they're gender traders, they're whatever the answer is. False consciousness, blah, 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 blah. This kind of excuse has been around forever, right? You only look at the ones who agree. And then you take their lived experiences, so their anecdotal testimonies, the things that they've been through, and their attributions, their interpretations critically of their experiences. So their attribution of intentionality is the critical part here. You take that and you treat it as though it's incorrigible. This is like the Pope speaking ex cathedra. You may not question this. If you do, then you are denying people's lived experiences. You're erasing their voices. You're this, that, and the other. This is one of the central strategic tools and propagandistic tools that are used by woke folk, and countering it does require a good conceptual understanding of what's actually being meant by listen to people's lived experience. There's parentheses, there's an asterisk there that includes implicitly listen and believe.
Yeah, this idea that's that we have to prioritize lived experience over everything, it raises a couple of things, right? Because the expectation would be that there is a Black lived experience, and they treat it as if that lived experience is a monolith. It's only one experience.
Yeah,
and
it's not a Black lived experience. It is the Black lived experience.
Exactly.
And all deviations from it are an aberration. It is false consciousness. It is Uncle Tomery. It's blah blah blah. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
No,
that's an important point.
Yeah, and someone like Coleman Hughes or John McWhorter or Glenn Lowry, even God help us all, Candace Owens. These are people, these are deviations. Not only deviations, but either they are complicit in the white narrative, or they are white, or they'd go so far as to say, like, no, you're probably white passing at this point, even though you look nothing like white. These people do not help the narrative. And what concerns me about this, among many things that concerns me about this, is that if you are under the expectation that a Black person is supposed to think a certain way based on what they look like, not even based on the way that they were brought up with, but now based on what they look like, because even if they didn't grow up in the socioeconomic conditions that in their minds, the average Black person should grow up in, they are now, they're expected to be allies, as you said. So this to me sounds pretty damn racist. That is a good definition of racism right there. Expecting a person, like me, for instance, believe it or not, I'm not Chinese. I know I look Chinese or I look Asian. I am not Asian. I'm Mexican.
Yeah.
So there's there was a viral, not viral, but a pretty popular clip out there that went out there of James Lindsay getting into trouble for making a joke. And that's like, people expect me to act a certain way or to believe certain things. And by people, I mean the people in these fields, just because of the color of my skin and because of my nationality. That to me seems more sinister, more nefarious than someone who just simply doesn't want to, like, just wants to, like, go away from, like, I don't know, like, I just don't understand how people don't realize just what it is that they're saying. Like, do you have any idea what you're saying when you say that a Black person has to believe certain things because of his skin color? That to me, that's racist.
Yeah, it's a form of moral essentialism. If you belong to category X, then you must have corresponding political incentives Y, and will therefore conduct yourself in a manner Z. If you don't conduct yourself in a manner Z, or if you don't express political opinion Y, then your authenticity as a member of category X is called into question. And that's when terms like traitor and grifter and blah 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 start to get thrown around.
Yeah.
It's a morally essentialist, morally prescriptive, totalitarian ideology.
And that's what distinguishes us from other people, because as you said at the beginning of this podcast, you and I pretty, we subscribe to liberalism, so we care about the individual. But when you have this collectivist mindset in which what matters is the group, then you run into issues, because it doesn't matter what what John McWhorter's own personal experience is. Doesn't matter. Like, they even make fun of it. They call us, like, oh, these these utopian individualists that think that somehow even matters. It's like, well, sure, and they make fun of stuff like colorblindness, right? Almost treating it as if nobody is colorblind. Why are you even wasting your time with this concept of colorblindness? But I think the proper way of viewing these sort of things, the proper way of viewing individualism, of viewing colorblindness, of viewing liberalism, is not as a place in which we can already be at, but as a process. Yeah, sure, we're not colorblind. There are innate biases in us that make us prioritize one race over the other. Yes, that is true. But the best way to solve it, or to minimize the damage that is caused by lethality, is to act as if we are colorblind, or to try to get there. Act as if the individual matters more than the group mentality. I think that's the proper way of going about it. What do you think?
Well, I have my own ideas about the supposed subconscious biases that supposedly influence the manner in which races treat each other. I have some serious doubts, just looking at the literature of things like the implicit association test. But putting that off to the side, the basic moral idea that you're putting forward is broadly correct. It is, you can't morally essentialize. This fundamentally is the problem with at least their version of collectivism, in that it essentializes the various collective categories in terms of the interests of the group. They don't allow for a spectrum of interests which can range from politics that they disagree with to politics they agree with. It's, you either agree with this set of politics or you don't properly belong to this group. You're an aberration of some sort. And liberalism is different in that respect. It's tolerant. because it accepts that in any sizable polity, you're going to have a spectrum, you're going to have a distribution of political ideologies, and that this is not a product of stupidity or poor character necessarily, but rather just differences in character, differences in upbringing, and perhaps even to some extent differences in certain innate characteristics that might that might tend a person toward one direction or another, at least to some degree. They're not prepared to accept this. Their basic thesis on how society conditions us and what the proper emancipatory, this is a very Manichaean worldview. It's a world of absolute light versus absolute dark. No pun intended. And yeah, this is the recipe for a dysfunctional society.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, we're gonna have to end it there because it's mentioned there.
Yeah.
A few things come up, but KC, I want to thank you for coming back on again. It's always great to talk to you.
Likewise, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, not a problem. And everyone, the link to your channel and to everything that you want to promote is in the description of the video below, and is I'll mention it at the beginning of the podcast as well. But once more, thanks for coming on, man, and I hope to see you again in the future.
Have a good one.
You too.